Vicki, I think we're good to go.
Okay, sounds good. All right, my name is Vicki O'Neill, and I am the Long Island Sound Study Habitat Restoration Stewardship Coordinator located at New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And I'd like to welcome everybody to this very exciting webinar opportunity, Funding Basics for Long Island Sound Communities, Crafting Competitive Proposals for the National Coastal Resilience Fund and beyond. I think this is a great opportunity for our Long Island Sound partners to learn a little bit about grants and a new grant opportunity for all of us to learn. I'd like to introduce Harry Yamalis.
Thanks, Vicki. Harry Yamalis, the Connecticut Deep's Land and Water Resources Division, also the Connecticut co-chair for the Habitat Restoration Stewardship Work Group of the Long Island Sound Study National Estuary Program. I'm Vicki's counterpart in Connecticut. And to avoid any further delay, I'll just immediately turn it over to Joanne Throwe. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. First of all, thanks, Vicki and Harry. You know, this is all about partnerships, right? And they have been amazing being partners with National Coastal Resilience Fund, which we will talk about today. But first, before we get started, I want to introduce our team. Backstopping this webinar today, I am Joanne Throwe. I'm president of Throwe Environmental. I'm going to talk a little bit more about our work with this particular grant funding opportunity, but we work on climate resilience planning and financing. My background has been in water quality and quantity work in the Chesapeake Bay, primarily most of my career, but really moving forward in New England. So I'm here in Rhode Island, so grew up in Connecticut, and I'm thrilled to be connected with Long Island Sound. This is just a wonderful opportunity. I feel like I'm coming back home. I'm joined by the amazing Kyle Gray. I seem to always say amazing Kyle Gray, who you will hear from shortly. He is a project partner with Throwe Environmental, and also amazing is Taylor Throwe. Yes, that is the same last name. So she is backstopping this webinar today for us. So without further ado, Kyle, why don't you get started and put the slides up? And we're going to really be able to focus on taking some of the tips on that we want to share with you that we've collected, certainly over many years for me doing this work on grant funding, but particularly as it moves towards financing and really moving local governments and communities forward on becoming more resilient, but also looking about applying some of those funding basics to a particular grant funding opportunity. So with that, Kyle, why don't you start us off and then I'll pick it up.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Joanne. So again, welcome everyone. Excited to have you all today, especially in a conversation tailored at New York and Connecticut. This should be great. Just a few things to note before we do get started. We will be sending the recording and the slides out to everyone who is registered after this session's over. So if you missed something or you've got to step away, no worries there. And then just kind of basic Zoom logistics, feel free to enter any questions that you have in the Q&A box. Specifically tech questions we'll get to as we move along. Any questions about the content we'll cover after we're done with these slides, and then we will open it up a little bit later on in the webinar to have a more project-based discussion where we'll invite folks to unmute if they'd like to. So with that, I can start getting us started with some of this content. So as Joanne mentioned, we'll be going over some key funding tips, tricks, really some of the basics when it comes to grant funding opportunities that are targeted at climate resilience. And then we'll tie that into the National Coastal Resilience Fund as kind of our key example here. There we go. All right. So again, this is kind of our course for the whole presentation. After we go through some of our examples, we'll talk a little bit about climate finance, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A and have a discussion after that. So to get us started, you can really structure some of these funding basics that we'll cover. When we talk about the grant process overall, before, during, and after you start writing. So when we think about some of those tips that we have before you even begin writing a grant proposal, right? it really centers on making sure that you're picking and targeting the right project or program for your specific funding source that you're looking for. So, and of course, there'll be overlap here from all the different stages that we'll be covering, but we should be thinking about this more holistically. This is just one way to structure that. So again, in this first stage, we really want to think about how we're identifying and prioritizing the right programs. Most basically, we really want to encourage folks to develop their ideas out beforehand, right? Before that funding opportunity comes across your desk. You should have a good sense of what the project goals are, maybe the overall vision for the project, and how it will fit within the larger community. And when we think about the community here, it's really important that these projects are community-based, that we're working directly with community stakeholders throughout the process to make sure that there's the buy-in that we need, and to really highlight that community engagement when we go for grant funding opportunities. So all of that being said, upfront, you'd really like to establish a clear plan of action, right? What the goals are for a given project, and maybe the goals for funding, the different objectives that come out of those goals, as well as the timeline and how responsibilities are delegated. And then, probably the most key question here is this the right program for your project, right? So you'll have all these different projects that you might be able to tee up for a funding source, but is that a good match? And to determine that, we have to think about things like eligibility, match requirements. We have to consider the amount of the award and how that impacts the project that you're trying to do, the different types of projects, and priorities overall, right? Whether or not your priorities with a given project align with the priorities for that funding program itself. And to really help determine all of that, one way to do that is to connect with the program officer kind of early and often. So that can mean, having a phone call, going through some emails, whatever it might be, making sure that there's a strong line of communication between the folks putting together the proposal and the folks in charge of running that program. That can help really make sure that your project aligns with the program you're applying for, as well as really target any of those unnecessary hurdles that might come up early on rather than waiting. So that's the earlier stage, before you start writing. Then when you're actually writing the proposal, there are some key things to think about as well. And here it really centers on communications and writing. So making sure that the way you're communicating the project actually, sets the tone that you want it to for the entire project. So it's important here to not only make sure that you're talking about the project itself, but to make sure that you clearly and concisely demonstrate your need and the impact that that project will have on the overall community. So again, you want to make sure that you're demonstrating that need clearly. And one way to do that is by really thinking about this, with the lens that you're selling your project to the reviewers here. So you want to make it as easy as possible for them to match up the criteria that they'll be judging a project by, all of that. You want to make their job as easy as possible and to make the different highlights that you're trying to bring forward as clear as possible. And all of that being said, with all of these different funding opportunities that are out there, we have to make sure that we're adapting to each different funding program. So that's not to say that your project should change completely, but that is to say that you might want to pull out some key language from the grant solicitation, or really, you might want to emphasize different components of a project to make sure that it's a good fit for that grant opportunity. And then kind of on the same note as community engagement that I mentioned a few minutes ago, we also want to think about building partnerships. So whether that's partnerships within a local government, or maybe we're thinking about drawing in outside partners, granting agencies really love to see diverse partnerships and a broad range of support for given projects. So showing that, again, early and often will just stand to make your project more competitive. And then lastly, once we're done with the grant writing process, there's still work to do. So going back to 8th grade English, we've got to reread, revise the project, the proposal itself. We've got to think through some of the language, make sure we're editing the grammar, all of that. It sounds basic, but those are very important, because too often, proposals will come in and the project itself is great, but the language just isn't there. It comes across a little bit weaker, and that's not what we want. Here it's important to make sure that we've got a strong title and a strong abstract that clearly articulate, what this project is all about, and, doing so in an attractive and engaging way for the reviewers. It's important also to compare back to those program priorities again. I mentioned this a few minutes ago, thinking about the criteria that your project is being judged by. That's a great way to kind of work some of those key things into your proposal, so that when the reviewer has their rubric that they're grading your project on, they can easily match it up and see where you score highest. And then if you don't get funded, that's obviously okay. More often than not, you will not, just because of the the nature of this type of funding program. But that's fine. There are ways to recycle your proposals that haven't been accepted, and there are ways to build off of the feedback that you've gotten. And it's really all about adaptation here, making sure that if you're applying for the same program in the second or third year, you might want to look at the new funding solicitation to make sure that you're really addressing that current year's goals and priorities. And then again, making sure that you're building on any feedback that's been identified from the solicitation that you did not get funded in. So I will leave that there for a minute. Joanne, did you have anything else to add on maybe funding tips that we wanted to cover or highlight for folks?
Yeah, so thanks, Kyle. Just taking a moment to say that these tips, obviously, many of you are probably aware of them, right? And you're wondering why. You've tried and you've put in proposals, and it's a lot of work. These tips are here to help make you have a stronger proposal. They're certainly not all of them, right? And you have to think about not just trying to fit a particular funding opportunity to every single project you have. I'm encouraging the folks on the webinar today to think more holistically. Think about what your community needs, how your community will be impacted, how stakeholders will be engaged. Are you reaching the right audience? Do you have elected leaders who are involved and aware of what's going on? So there's other key components of this when you're thinking through just, more than writing a grant. So I wanted to drive those points home, and I will also pick up some of those points through my part of the presentation. So back to you, Kyle.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So we will get to Joanne's part of the presentation in just a minute, and she'll really give us a deep dive into one funding program that we can apply all of these tips to, and that's the National Coastal Resilience Fund. But before I do that, I want to spend just a minute or two going over another program offered by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and that is the Long Island Sound Futures Fund. So I'm sure many of you are aware of this program, so I won't go too in depth here. But we did want to tee this up as one opportunity that we can really use to apply those funding tips to. So just as some background, currently this is around a $5 million a year program. That's how much was available in fiscal year 21. And since 2005, the program's awarded over $25 million. So that's great. And we think about the activities that are being awarded through the Futures Fund. And it covers things like habitat restoration and resilience, water quality, education, fish passage, as well as nitrogen prevention, planning and implementation activities. But what's important to note here is that these different activities are funded in different areas of the watershed. So for example, habitat restoration and resilience only are funded in the coastal areas of the watershed in Connecticut and New York. And then kind of working our way backwards, those nitrogen prevention and planning activities can happen further north in the watershed when we move towards Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. So not to go too in depth on that, but that's just one example of how the eligibility might be a little tricky if you're not aware of that up front. So deliberately making sure that you determine your eligibility early and you have a good understanding on what is or is not fundable, that saves a lot of time, and it helps circumvent any capacity issues that you might run into further down the line. But again, this is one funding opportunity in this area, and it really works to hit on these 4 key priorities that you see on screen. So we've got things like clean water and watersheds, thriving habitats, communities that are both sustainable and resilient, and then making sure all of this is really grounded in inclusive management and sound science. So in thinking about some of those tips for the Long Island Sound Futures Fund, again, I mentioned make sure that we're determining eligibility early. If you're looking for a project that has a design component to it, it's important that applicants who do have that design component should reach out early for some pre-application conversations with the program officers. Again, making sure that those happen upfront. And then when you're putting together your proposal, it's really critical to make sure that you're aligning with those priorities that you see on screen, as well as the criteria that you're being judged by. And then finally, making the connection to the Long Island Sound Conservation, Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan. That can make all the difference here, right? That's where proposals become very competitive. So if you're connecting to that comprehensive management plan and the specific implementation actions that come out of that plan, that shows that you're considering, the regional or, the larger impacts across the entire sound watershed, right? And that again just shows the scale of the impact and how competitive your project might be. So that's our one example on the Futures Fund. I'll leave it there with that, but I will pass it back over to Joanne, and she'll spend the next couple of slides going over the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's National Coastal Resilience Fund.
Thank you, Kyle. And I'm just going to have you move my slides for me. So as Kyle said, we're going to talk a little bit of taking his tips and applying it to a particular grant opportunity that I'm very excited about sharing more information about in detail, because as I said, Throwe Environmental, our focus has been on climate resilience, planning, financing, really moving communities forward to be resilient, right? And so what an exciting opportunity Throwe Environmental has to be field liaisons for NFWF on the National Coastal Resilience Fund. So just so you understand our role and why Throwe Environmental is talking about this in particular, it's because we are the field liaisons. We are looking to make sure we move resilience forward in these coastal communities by giving you the support you need to think through your particular, idea or project. So you've got many resources, some which are on this webinar, but our hope is to promote climate resilience. Connecticut and New York are doing such amazing things moving forward. So it's sometimes very confusing which funding source you should go for, how much work it's going to be, what fits in terms of your project idea. So the follow-up, our opportunity here for you is to give you feedback on project ideas and be that liaison between NFWF or some of the other program partners who might want to be, learning more about your particular project. So next, Kyle. That's our role. I just wanted to clarify that. So let's talk about this very exciting National Coastal Resilience Fund. Now, as I said, I've been doing, work in this area for, most of my career as it relates to how to pay for environmental protection activities. And, when this fund came out, it's a fairly new fund, and that's why this is a wonderful opportunity to really share some highlights from this program for you. So it was only established in 2018, so administered by NFWF, and it brings in a strong partnership, right? So we are hearing so much about climate change and climate resilience, and what a wonderful opportunity that NFWF and NOAA and US Department of Defense and EPA, AT&T and others, they really came together to be able to leverage this partnership and move forward on conservation, looking for conservation outcomes. So on average, it's been investing about $32 million in resilience, community coastal resilience. And what I want to say is that you see on this slide, and it's bold because it's not just about community resilience, but also the fish and wildlife benefits as well. So I'm, as somebody who has been involved in natural resources, it's just very exciting fund opportunity. So I get a little excited to share it, and I'm going to go into a little more detail. So next slide, Kyle. All right, so you're watching this from Connecticut or New York, and you're wondering, well, what is this coastal footprint, right? Will my particular project idea, or my area, my community fit within this footprint that would be potentially funded through the National Coastal Resilience Fund? And I encourage you, I love that NFWF has this tool. They have many tools that you should make sure you're perusing on their website, but the NCRF, the National Coastal Resilience Tool footprint, right? And you could actually go in and you could put in your community. So much of Connecticut, I guess, there's parts that up by maybe Simsbury, there's a little part of Connecticut that's not included in this, but much of Connecticut is. Areas of New York, I really encourage you to go into this, and you'll see the watersheds and what, whether your community applies. Next. So one of the things that's also unique about this is, the eligibility, with grants, is we've all been through many grant, processes and looking at this. You look at the eligibility now, states and tribal agencies or territorial tribal groups can apply. You've got the municipal governments. I know that we've got plenty on this call, your nonprofits, your educational institutions. So we've got the groups that could be eligible. What's interesting here is also commercial organizations. That's not always found. But what I'm encouraging you, and I'm going to talk about this in more detail, but think about when you're looking at this list of eligibility, think about partnerships, always go towards partnerships, especially for small municipalities who are just sometimes overwhelmed with, the process of applying for grants. So it's all about partnerships. Next, Kyle. All right. So something I want to just drive home again with NCRF, and, you're thinking about your benefits on community resilience, but as it relates to flooding and erosion, but you also have to think about the fish wildlife habitat here. And, sometimes we talk to communities and they say, well, I know there's we want to do this project. I know there is, a chance to, protect fish and wildlife and improve the habitat, but we're not exactly sure the details of it. This goes back to the partnership idea. There's a lot of resources out there. There's organizations who can help you better determine that. And we encourage that sense of reaching out and connecting with the right people to get that information and better understand what that connection back to fish, wildlife, and habitat may be. So this particular project invests in nature-based solutions. So we've done a webinar in the recent past that, really tried to navigate, I was actually for Connecticut, I believe, and trying to navigate some of these funding opportunities. And I know BRIC is out there and other things. There's just so many different opportunities. This really is an investment in nature-based solutions. And you'll see some of these, like the recent REPI military grants, they're moving towards nature-based solutions. And this is just ideal. What a wonderful opportunity to get back into, less brick and mortars and more towards the nature-based opportunities here. So this fund also focuses on transferability, scale, innovation, and adaptability. I'm going to take a few examples in a couple slides to show you what I mean by that. Next. All right, so what does it cover? So what I love about this fund is that there's something for everyone, right? Depending on where you are. So it covers that capacity building and planning. So there's so many times you're saying to yourself, and you're in meetings and you're in your municipality and you are looking for a plan, you're looking for more direction. That this is an opportunity to think through what the capacity building grant could be. And I'll share a little more detail about that in a moment. But you've also got the site assessment and preliminary design. You've got the final design and permitting, all the way through restoration and monitoring. So we've got a note here on the side, a couple notes that I want to bring to your attention. So sometimes NFWF will see that people are trying to go, in multiple categories. try to focus on one priority category, right? One of these, and look at your desired outcome, right? It's going to make you more competitive. What's beautiful about these categories is it's a pipeline is intended, right? To prepare you for that next stage. And again, driving home that, whether it's this fund or any fund, thinking about the impacts to fish and wildlife in your projects, always so important. But this one in particular, they must advance community resilience and fish and wildlife. And again, I keep saying this over and over, nature-based solutions, that should be the focus. Next, Kyle. All right, so oftentimes, and I think there's Norwalk might be on this call today, Norwalk, Connecticut. And, I'm going to use them as an example, starting out with having conversations among their various departments. And recently they reached out to us just thinking through where they need to be. Do they need a community, capacity building grant to move forward on community resilience? Average length of a community project would be 2 years. You could have this comprehensive plan when you're done, a plan that includes stakeholder engagement. Think through who needs to be at that table, and whether we're doing one category or another here, there should be some component of stakeholder engagement. Most times, and I've done this enough when I'm bringing recommendations to council or commissioners, if you're not engaging the stakeholders, you're waiting until the last minute, and that's when, you get that feedback you're not looking for. So bring them in, throughout the process, but certainly in that community building, capacity building stage. And again, it moves you towards those resilience projects that include nature-based features. Next, Kyle. So the next category, site assessment and preliminary design. So average project length, and this fund is, can be flexible. We're saying average. There's not a set time frame that you must build in. NFWF is, if anything, they are flexible. They understand things happen, but on average, it gives you an idea that it's about a year-long process for this. And we're looking for preliminary designs to be 30 to 60% completed, go or no-go decision type of decision, to help determine those appropriate sites. And really, when you're thinking about site assessment and preliminary design, you should have seen that some projects are prioritized in some previous planning activity. And, you shouldn't just be randomly picking this. There should be a method to the madness here, right? And you should have some idea in previous plans, be it a hazard mitigation plan or some other climate resilience plan. So focusing on a specific assessment. And remember, this is where you should be having those preliminary conversations with permitters, and also including some baseline monitoring is absolutely acceptable and encouraged. Next. Oh, the final design and permitting stage, right? And this is about a year and a half. We're looking for final design to be about 90 to 100% completed at this point, moving forward, and permitting conversations are well underway and taking place. And you're looking that these projects are ready for restoration, right? And ready for implementation and ready for all the permitting that needs to take place. And this can also include your baseline monitoring. Next, last category. So this is the big one, the restoration and monitoring. And I think everybody on this call has some idea of where they fit in on one of these opportunities. So this could be about 3 years, and it will include a year of monitoring. This is your implementation and monitoring stage, right? And your key components here are prioritizing. This project has been prioritized in previous activities, your planning activities, you have completed your assessments and your design, and you have a clear understanding of your permitting requirements. So let's drive some of those points home with examples. But before I do, let me give you some tips. So Kyle gave you a list of, grant tips. And so here we're going to throw some out here. I've already made the connection between making sure competitive proposals will have that community resilience and fish and wildlife benefit. We want to make sure that you're conveying that nature-based solutions are planned, intended, and considered for implementation. Let's talk a moment about match. I know, from the many meetings over the years for different communities, match is often a struggle. And I don't want people to get discouraged because they're attending this webinar and saying, we don't have match. Come, if you have a good idea, work with the idea, you have a particular need, let's think through match. We could do that for a pre-proposal stage. Your match does not necessarily have to be completely secured, but that would be, something to think about. So let's not apply because you don't have the match at this point. A good idea, partnerships, match couldn't be found at some point, but don't be discouraged if you just don't have match in place. We're looking for well-written on any funder, right? You have to, be it this fund or any other fund, think through well-written, explicitly addressing the points made in the RFP. I know that sounds like, hey, we should know that, but you wouldn't believe how many times that you read a proposal and you're saying, wait, I'm not getting to the point. How does this address what I'm looking for in the guidelines? So as Kyle said, put it aside, put your points in, put it aside, come back to it. Just think about a well-written proposal that follows the RFP. And then applying your project specifically to the goals and vision of this particular program. Next. Got a few more slides and then we're going to wrap up and open up for questions. So a few more taking tips that I wanted to share. I can't say enough about partnerships, and with smaller municipalities, in the region, it is really difficult to try to go at this alone sometimes. You're just wearing 5 different hats. You are just doing so many different things for your community. You're not quite sure who to engage. It starts with a phone call or a meeting, at conversations, and you wouldn't believe how often you can really put a team together to help support you. And so diverse partnerships and that community engagement is key. Stick to one of those priorities. Don't try to balance all of them, and think about how you can make sure it's adaptable. And you must consider, and I'm thinking this for many programs, always think in the longer term conditions. Think ahead and think what you can expect at the end of the story here. But that's something very important. Think about those broad impacts. Is your project potentially transferable to other communities who can benefit from what you're doing? And I love this particular fund because of the innovation. It allows for innovation. When I see innovation as part of certain funds, that encourages, thinking outside the box, opportunities to really promote, new concepts and ways to do things. And so, looking at balancing innovation and record of previous success certainly is important. Next. All right, I'm going to quickly go through a couple of examples. Now, this using salt marsh habitat restoration for resilience. This was a National Coastal Resilience Fund award. And, it's taking place in Massachusetts. And what's really interesting, choosing this one because, it's looking at historic ditching from, the colonial times and going back to, ag practices that really impacted the land and the marsh. So, getting a process that is trying to, fix that damage and get it back to its natural state. I mean, this was an area not just with agricultural techniques that impacted the land, but mosquito control techniques as well. So although this is a very large area of land and less urban than, some of the communities that would be on, one of the key points here is the partnerships that were engaged in this, which is really exciting. So it was on, developed into something that was building, tested somewhere else, and then brought to scale here. And so this also has innovation in it, as they're bringing up the islands, and they were able to build this salt marsh, the sparrow, with the habitat for the salt marsh sparrow. So, this has a little bit of everything in it, and they were able to utilize and leverage other funding opportunities to make this project happen. Next. Okay, so in Fairhaven, not too far from me, in Massachusetts here. So this is removing dredge material and reintroducing tidal hydrology and plant marsh migration. Again, it had the fish and habitat enhancement. It also, even though, the National Coastal Resilience Fund is very much focused on, obviously the water quantity, the impacts of flooding, erosion, sea level rise, but the impacts here connecting back to the enhancement of water quality was so important. Next. Okay, so the Maurice River project, this is down in New Jersey. And this was exciting because of the fact they built also the strong partnerships with the communities around, the Delaware Bay area is an important coastal environment, and it's home to, the related economies with that rely on the oyster and the fishing and the bird watching and of course ecotourism. But the natural resources and the community were seeing the impacts of climate change to their community and being very vulnerable. So they took this initiative to build the partnerships, work with the communities. They engaged the elected officials and the stakeholders to, move this project forward. Next. Okay, and then I think this might be my last example. So this one is in southern Mastic Beach. We're talking about New York. Many of you may already know this. This project was focused on a low-lying area that was significantly impacted. It was affected by episodic flooding, and it was making it very challenging, specifically for some of the lower or moderate income homeowners. And they were in a relatively regularly flooded area. And I'm saying this as I'm watching these winds from today's nor'easter that's coming through. We're seeing more of this happening, right? So we've got an opportunity here to work on community resilience and hopefully, work with the community and the stakeholders involved to restore the salt marsh. So this is a really exciting project. It was an opportunity to bring, the existing partners together on this project. Again, I'm saying the same things over: partnership, stakeholder engagement. So I'm hoping I'm driving those points home. Next slide. All right, so Kyle, I'm going to turn this over. They're tired of hearing from me. I'm going to turn this over for a couple slides, and I want to drive a few points home on funding and financing, and then we'll open it up for conversation. And at this point, I'm going to encourage people to start putting questions and comments in chat.
Perfect.
Kyle?
Thanks so much, Joanne. And that was exactly what I was going to say too. Any questions that you have on the content that we're covering, now's a great time to start putting them in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those once these slides are up. So we got maybe 4 or so more slides, and then we'll start our discussion. So right here, we kind of want to transition because everything that we've been talking about to this point has all been related to funding, right? So it's the National Coastal Resilience Fund, the Long Island Sound Futures Fund, and then those funding tips, right? And funding's great, but it does have its limits. So what we want to talk about now is sustainable financing, right? Long-term sustainable investments. And the question you might ask is, why would you choose sustainable financing over grant funding, especially when grant funding's free? But that's because we know that there are perpetual funding and capacity issues that come up in practically every community that we work in, right? Every community notes that having funds that are recurring, stable, and dedicated, that can be challenging. So that's what financing offers, right? It has that opportunity to have a funding stream that is stable, right? It's stable over time and it has dedicated funding coming in on an ongoing basis. And because of that, financing dollars are more reliable, right? They give your community more control, and they're honestly and frankly just more responsible because they really commit a community to addressing its priorities that it's identified throughout the planning processes. So financing also allows us to take on more significant climate investments. And we obviously know the scale of climate investments that are needed globally, and that's monumental. But when we think about that on a town by town basis, that's still pretty high. And what financing does is it offers that opportunity to draw in outside capital and outside investment to help make paying for those climate investments a little bit easier for your town. And again, I really want to drive home this point that financing puts your community in the driver's seat. You set the priorities on what you would be financing, on what you'd be funding, and what is important when we talk about climate resilience. So one example of a sustainable financing scheme related to climate resilience is the Stormwater Utility. And very important to note here that this is not the right fit for every community, and that's perfectly okay. But it does serve as a really good example of climate financing. So when we think about stormwater management, we know that grants typically fund implementation. So if you're thinking about, stormwater outfalls or a network of catch basins, whatever it might be, the grants would be great to fund the installation of those different practices, right? Or even if we're thinking green infrastructure, grants would fund that implementation. However, grants do not typically fund operations and maintenance over time. So while you might have a bioswale taking in stormwater, and that's great for the environment, keeping up with that over time and maintaining that bioswale is not grant funded, right? That's something that communities need to figure out how to pay for on their own. And financing offers a great opportunity to dedicate funding streams to that operations and maintenance. Stormwater utilities do that through an equitable fee based on impermeable surface area. And it's a recurring funding mechanism, right? This comes up on a quarterly or annually basis. And those funds can then not only be used for operations and maintenance, but they can be invested, they can be used for grant match. And then it removes those funds that might typically be used for maintenance from the general fund. So now those dollars are no longer competing with all of the other different priorities in your community. And again, like I mentioned, green infrastructure, that's one of the climate smart practices that can be used here, but some towns even offer credits against the utility charge by using green practices. So that's just a fun little component to add in here. So now, yeah, it all sounds great, but how would you go about making funding and financing work for your community? And I would say the kind of silver bullet answer here is to make or develop a financing system that reflects your community itself, right? You want to be really individualized here. And that's not to say that you can't continue pursuing grants, right? Grants are great, but you should be leveraging grants and financing dollars together kind of cohesively. You don't want to rely too much on grants, but you also want to make sure that you're doing so in a way that, again, is smart and leverages the financing opportunities. It's also important to establish those financing systems before you need them. So before a disaster strikes, or maybe before you're making a big climate investment, whether it's putting an enterprise fund in place beforehand, just setting all of that up, or really taking advantage of certain political opportunities or community buy-in, community support, whatever it might be. Establishing those systems before you need them is always more proactive. And again, just to drive home that point, make sure that we're building financing systems that reflect your community needs. So that's a lot to throw at you at once on this topic of financing. And it's great because there are different resources out there to guide you through the financing process, right? And these tools are very attractive to funders, right? Different tools, resources, spreadsheets that are out there help document kind of where you're going and where you've been. And you can show that to funders, and they like to see kind of the paper trail of how you've gone through those planning steps. So one tool that fits kind of this mold is the Planning to Action Climate Toolkit, which our team at Throwe Environmental has developed. And if you're familiar with the US Climate Toolkit developed at the federal level, this will look very familiar to you. We actually kind of built off of that original toolkit and really kind of just broadened it out and expanded it quite a bit. So we do have a video tutorial. I'm not going to tee that up today. We really want to get into our discussion. But if you're interested in learning more about this, you can visit our website. It's throwe-environmental.com/toolkit. Or you can just search Planning to Action Climate Toolkit or search Throwe Environmental, either one on YouTube. And you'll see this tutorial video and learn a little bit more about this tool itself. So with that, that is our final slide. I've got no more slides up here. So we will invite folks to continue to put questions in the Q&A. And I will turn it over to Joanne. Do you want to say something quick before?
I do. Of course I do, right, Kyle?
Always
So we want to bring as many tools and opportunities. So if we find something that communities can use, we want to share it, right? And so we're making as many resources as possible. We encourage you to explore NFWF's website, learn more about the National Coastal Resilience Fund, reach out to you've got EPA resources, NOAA resources, you've got your state resources, so important. And we wanted to touch on financing and funding for a couple reasons. Because some of the communities participating in this webinar might be at the stage where you are just thinking about planning. And, we've done this enough that, you've got a plan that if you don't talk about how it's going to be paid for, it's going to remain a plan. So don't be afraid of having the word finance fit into your overall structure. Talk to your elected leaders and your department, colleagues, and start thinking through, well, how are we going to pay for this? Is it just going to be grant from grant to grant? Or are we going to go beyond? Connecticut, for instance, has some very good legislation this past session that you could, and the previous one, that you could consider moving forward. So what our goal is to make these communities more resilient and bring as many resources to the table as we can to get you where you need to be. And how wonderful we can do it in our own backyard. So, we want to be a resource. And what we're hoping from today's conversation is you took away some tips, right? Some useful tips. And, we'd love to hear from you if there is a project that you are considering. Again, I'm going to put Norwalk on, they reached out, they have an idea, they, want a little more feedback. The idea is not to wait necessarily till an announcement comes out. We all know this. As soon as it comes out, you're rushing around. How many weeks do I have to fill this out? Start planning now. This is the point of getting together today and start thinking through having those conversations with potential partners. Reach out to us. Tell us what you might be interested in for your project, what stage you are at. We're here to help you on NCRF. And I know with the Long Island Futures Fund, NFWF would be very happy to give guidance as well. There's so many resources. It's hard to navigate all of the opportunities, but having the conversations now will help you in the long run. So don't wait, start thinking about these tips now and your projects now. And I hope you found this interesting, and we'd love to have a conversation with everyone. So to that end, thank you, Harry and Vicki. Would you like to get us started on raising hands and fielding questions?
Sure. Guys, go ahead and raise your hands, participants, so we can get to you as time allows. I'm going to start with some of the ones that are in the question answer box. First two that caught my eye were both by anonymous attendee, both questions, maybe the same person. If you speak to one priority, prevent from including an implementation phase then. If your goal is implementation, can you apply for one priority? Is it assumed capacity building and planning is then happening with some other source of funding? I think from the presentation, I gathered that when you're instructed to only pick one priority for your application, it's just so the the funding admin can sort it into the right box by priority type. Now you might have goals and targets and activities and such that fit into multiple priorities. But I think they're trying to say, pick one that's your highest priority out of all of those and put yourself in that box. You might compete best there. But yes, you'll likely have activities that fit into multiple priority types that are listed in the RFP. Now, without knowing what MBS stands for and CCBP stands for, that might be the best answer I can give for this one so far. If you want to put what they mean in the chat box, I might be able to give more information.
Yes. Oh, well, Harry, you're hired. That was a great explanation, but nature-based solutions, and because slides, we're trying to keep them short. So Kyle's going to spell that out for you in the chat. But you're right. It makes it easier, and it doesn't mean you're not at different stages. But again, going back to be very clear on what you're asking for, make this easier for the funders. Don't try to throw everything in the kitchen sink into your request. Be very clear and direct about what your needs are. Not one grant that's out there will cover everything you have going on in your community, but this gets you an opportunity to think forward and think what your needs are. So that was a wonderful summary, Harry. Thank you. Other questions?
I don't see any hands raised yet, but 2 questions by Greg Riley. The second one is definitely for you folks at Throwe Environmental. Do you want to tackle that one first? It says, does Throwe Environmental offer counseling services to municipalities, grant applications on a pro bono basis?
So that's a tricky one. So thank you for that question. We will happily give guidance. We're not going to write proposals. We're not going to, we'll give you guidance on these tips and maybe how to strengthen your proposal, but we will not be doing the writing for you. But really, if it's for NCRF, we're here to, make sure that we have good representation from the Long Island Sound, that we really want to encourage projects, strong projects. So we'd love to have that conversation. We'd love to talk to you about it. How's that for a good punt on that question?
That's good. So the last question I see in the Q&A box, what are a variety of examples of community engagement with the municipality who is applying for a grant? What are examples of diverse partnerships? And the community engagement is when you reach out to the people, the immediate stakeholders, people that have an interest in that property, in the site, based on, I guess, proximity. Raise local volunteers, maybe reach out to a high school or a technical school to help out with some of the project. I think scouts are a great opportunity as well, a great resource, but I don't see them used a lot, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Go
that's
ahead.
a good question, Harry. And it could come in many forms, right? And so I'm again going to throw out some ideas, but it is going to be unique for your community. What we've seen is, everything from public meetings to regular workshops where, you're bringing in maps and, charts and whatnot to really get feedback from the community. It depends on the specific request of what you're applying for. But, honestly, I've done this enough that I could see where, having an effective outreach approach and community engagement really does mean success in the end. So it takes on many hats, but I would encourage people to brainstorm. And we've done this enough that we would, if you want to reach out and ask us what might work for a particular project, we're happy to do that. Kyle, did you want to add on the outreach? This is a big strength of yours too.
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of just underscoring a few key points. I think outreach should and can look different in each community. There shouldn't be one silver bullet on this one. But yeah, I mean, I think we've seen it in so many different ways. Joanne mentioned public workshops. And I mean, if there are questions on how that should look, I would say partnerships with community-based organizations, other community-based groups are a really great way to kind of tie that partnership and community engagement, both of those pieces together. And, making sure this comes from the ground up.
And in some communities that are very small, who might not have a very strong community organization or groups, what I encourage is also having an internal group set up. That could be a place where you start your conversations between various people within departments. And then who else needs to be at the table, right? So I don't want to just see usually people who don't quite represent the community, right? You want to have who are, be it the military, be it your aging population, or just citizens at large. You want to have your groups look like your community. You want all voices heard. So I encourage everybody, when they're thinking about outreach, and setting up work groups outside, engaging stakeholders, think through, is it, certain businesses in your community, the diversity on your community, making sure the wildlife and habitat organizations or experts might be involved who can help guide the conversations. So Harry, that's a long answer, but back to you.
Thank you. Since there's no more in the Q&A box, I mean, I'm happy to open this up to either more written or spoken questions about some project specifics. If you have a project you're thinking about applying for, maybe now's the time to throw out some questions about it, and we'll try to answer.
I'm going to go ahead and start unmuting people that raise their hands now.
Thanks, Taylor. Lillian, you want to go?
Yes, hi. This is Lillian Ruiz. I'm the Executive Director of the Council on Soil and Water Conservation. This is a long name for our state agency here in Connecticut. And we, as you may know, Connecticut, you just mentioned that we passed legislation on soil health last year, and we're trying to design a soil health program. And my question to you would be, can this type of funding be used to match federal funding? In other words, can NRCS programs be complemented by this funding?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Harry, go ahead.
All right.
You start and I'll follow
You
up.
can't match federal dollars with federal dollars, so I don't think you can match it. I think the term that's used for this is leveraging. Leveraging federal dollars and more federal dollars, but you still need each one of those sources, NCRF and NRCS will have their own match requirements and maybe different rates as well. And you can't double count match. So.
That's right. Thank you, Harry.
But you can use in-kind services as match too, if you're not federally funded.
There was a question, I think Kevin put it in the chat, and you're right, in-kind, and think through, for example, if you're having people come to a workshop, right, that you're hosting, have them sign in, that's leveraging in kind, think through what those options are on match that you're not thinking about. NFWF has been, very good on understanding match, and, always double check, because some grants just don't, their match requirements change. Thanks, Lillian.
Thank you.
Others?
We've officially got until 2:30. If anyone has a question about a specific habitat restoration site or maybe living shoreline, those are areas that I can help out with. The other three priorities, not so much.
We'd love to hear. We'd love to hear from you. It's an opportunity to really think through your project ideas, folks. Lillian, you're up again.
Okay, so since nobody is talking, I'm going to talk. The National Association of Conservation Districts has a coastal policy committee, and I am part of it. And I wonder, because they're tied, this committee reaches every single conservation district that has a coastal exposure, be it on the coast or lakes or whatever it is. I just wanted to throw it out there that there is such a thing as this organization, which is part of the NACD. And they are in contact, we are in contact with the conservation districts and with the municipal entities that deal with coastal issues all over the nation. So just introducing that to you because I saw your map and it resembles the map that we have for conservation districts that have, coastal issues in the US. So I just wanted to say hello from the NACD policy committee on coastal, and I don't remember it's another acronym that I forgot right now.
So Lillian, thanks for that. And I think what we'll do is follow up with you at some point in the future, in the near future, because, our job is to really make sure we're learning more, connecting, networking to bring these opportunities for the community. So if we can build partnership, think through project ideas, we're at your disposal. So we need to better understand a little more on the partnerships and this opportunity. So we will follow up. And thank you for bringing it to our attention. I encourage other people to as well. Maria, you had your hand raised. Taylor, can you unmute Maria?
Yep. I believe I'm muting. Yes. Hi, thank you so much for hosting this. So I'm Maria Rosa. I'm a professor of biology at Connecticut College, and I'm actually working on implementing a pilot living shoreline project. And I've had a lot of luck with smaller grants and some nonprofits donating. But for the bigger grants, I've applied to a few, and the main issue has either been that it's too much science for the conservation and restoration grants, or my research ones, don't have too much conservation restoration. So as like an academic institution, how can I address this? Because I thought they were great fits. So I applied for both these grants before. And of course, I haven't gotten as much feedback as I was hoping for. I try to ask for it, and I'm just kind of at a loss in terms of applying for these bigger grants as I try to scale up.
No, that's a great question, Maria. And I try to not talk about my background, but I spent a long time at the university, and so I understand where you're coming from in terms of that academic approach. And there are, as many grants out there and funding opportunities that probably less in recent years that really focus on the research or the academic side. Perhaps this particular fund is not the perfect fit, but that doesn't mean the work you're doing doesn't have a role somewhere in here. And perhaps thinking through how to apply that to the community resilience and more applied, maybe less academic, and the research and how we could see implementation move forward on some of these issues and focusing on those strong dual benefits. We're happy to have that conversation with you to learn more. So, helping you figure out, as Kyle said in one of those slides, don't give up, right? Work through it, and we're happy to give you some guidance on that offline.
I want to follow up as well. Hi, Maria. Thanks for joining us today. Good to see you again virtually. We met on site last month to look at the site, the Living Shoreline site that she wants to do at Con College. My recommendation is completely separate the data collection and publishing papers in the science from the design and implementation part. You can design and implement this with this program, I believe, as long as you don't talk about all the science you're going to do. Same is true with the Futures Fund or any other restoration fund that I know. You might have to do the fund your students. Well, you still fund students, I believe, with some of this. I've seen it in the budgets. But this should just be design and permitting implementation only. And any science you do might have to be with other grants. Maybe the smaller grant funds can cover that portion of it. I mean, look at the Reefball project in Stratford. Jennifer Mattei published a lot of science on that, and she got a lot of habitat restoration grants to build it, design it, and install it. So I don't see how you can't separate the two just for the application and still do the science separately. not part of this grant.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's great, Harry. I tell you, this is wonderful. Thank you. How about Ellen?
I just unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm with New York City Parks, and I think one way we've sort of been able to combine some innovative items and get at least already designs funded is through calling it a pilot project. So we've done some thin layer sediment that's in design by calling it pilot, but it's also very much research. So just throwing that out.
Yeah, and I would add though, Ellen, that oftentimes, we want to see as many competitive proposals as possible, right? And using the word pilot, going back to that transferability and scale, sometimes could be not as attractive and not as competitive. So I just want to give some guidance on, coming in, calling it pilot or just demonstration for this particular National Coastal Resilience Fund. But there's others, of course, that would also fit. Thank you though, Ellen.
Yeah.
Are there, I thought I saw another hand up. Taylor, was there somebody else? Oh, there's something in the chat. Let me see. Okay, anyone else? This is your time.
Joanne, I'll jump in here with actually a question that we got from the last webinar we did, but might be helpful for folks to hear about that. Someone
Kyle,
asked.
before you go, it looks like we have one more. We have
Oh,
another
perfect.
person.
Yep, go ahead. Cut me off, Tony. Good.
Go ahead, Tony, and then we'll get back to Kyle.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's like two questions. I saw a lot of examples in the slide. I work for New York City Parks as well. It seems like a lot of salt marsh restoration projects. Would upland coastal like forested areas be competitive in these type of grants? That's the first question.
Yeah, so, and we're just using some local examples. So by no means is that it just on salt marsh. There's so many wonderful, project ideas. And I would say it could be, and that would be something for NFWF and their partners to talk a little bit more about exactly, what, where, what, and how in terms of features. But we would, again, as field liaisons, be happy to have a conversation with you to talk through some of that. And I don't know if Harry has more to add.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's most likely eligible, but we'll have to wait for the RFP to come out and see what it says specifically. Looking at the past 15 years of the Long Island Sound Futures Fund, this should be eligible for the Futures Fund next year as well. And what state are you in?
New York.
Yeah. Okay, so your primary contact will be Vicky when you're ready to apply for one of these. But yeah, I depending on where you are in New York, I think you should be eligible for the Futures Fund. I'm 99.9% certain. And for this one, we have to wait and see what the RP says.
Yeah, and keep in mind, with NFWF and some of the other funding opportunities, it doesn't mean you can't look at multiple funding opportunities. So let's say Futures Fund covers one component. That doesn't mean that NCRF can't talk about another piece of it. So I want everybody to be encouraged, not discouraged, to bring their project ideas forward. But Tony, thanks. That was a great question. And Kyle, I'm going to throw it back to you while everybody.
Yeah, I'm actually going to follow up quick on what Tony just said, because that was a really good question. I think in our experience, I think we've just heard that, making sure that the coastal drivers are clear and that you're within the NCRF footprint. Those are kind of two key eligibility things that you might want to consider up front. But yeah, really good question. Thank you for that. And I was just going to say before that we've heard in the past folks asking whether or not projects have to be contiguous or not, and they don't necessarily have to be. But that is a question that we've gotten. Really, the important thing here is to make sure that they're happening at a larger scale, that they're connected. You start to work in that idea of transferability and the overall impact for the larger region.
And I do, Kyle, we should make it clear to everyone. We don't decide, Throwe Environmental does not decide who gets funded. We're just here to help navigate and hopefully bring in some really wonderful projects. We're about the communities, the natural resources. We're here as a resource for you. But when it comes to deciding on your proposal, that is not our role. That is all NFWF. So just want to make that clear. So with that, I don't know if there's any more questions. We'll give you back a little extra time in your day, but let me just double check, see if there's any other hands raised. Taylor, anything that you're seeing?
Real quick, I got a final comment for Tony. A good indicator might be to look at last year's NCRF RFP. It's 2 acronyms, and see what it says. They don't change too much from one year to the next. So if you're eligible last year, likely it'll be eligible this year.
So not seeing anything else, I do want to encourage people to know that we are a resource to you. And I really appreciate those who brought questions or want more information. Please feel free to reach out to us. And Harry and Vicky, you guys are amazing. And thank you so much for hosting us today.
Thanks for the wonderful information, and thanks to everybody else for joining us as well.
Okay. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.